They have set a nice fireplace on this lovely raining evening. Today we'd like to show our appreciation of Gothic literature in two wonderful games. My esteemed colleague and I mean to analyze how The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and Bloodborne feature elements characteristic of Gothic stories, such as themes, narrative devices, atmosphere, and the architectural design in their various settings. Twilight Princess draws many inspirations from Gothic literature and architecture. Whether intentional or unintentional, parallels are present across the various locations, bosses, or narrative themes both in the main game and its manga. The main plot of this story occurs when Zant, an invader from another dimension known as the Twilight Realm, overwhelms Hyrule Kingdom's forces and makes the ruler, Princess Zelda, hand over the castle. As Zant's forces begin to take over the entire world of light in an attempt to merge it with the Twilight Realm, they kidnap the children from Ordon Village, home to a young farmer named Link. Link pursues the kidnappers and in the process winds up in a portion of the merged Twilight Realm. Unknown to him at the time, Link was the wielder of the Triforce of Courage, a mystical gift from the three goddesses who created the world. As a result, unlike any other human exposed to the Twilight Realm, Link is shielded from the Dimension's effects and turns into a divine beast. A wolf, to be precise. Unfortunately for him, Link is defeated and taken to a dungeon. During his stay in the dungeon, he meets up with a helpful Twilight named Midna, the old ruler of the dimension whose throne was usurped by Zant. Together, they escape and meet up with Princess Zelda, who sends them on a quest for the necessary items to restore the kingdom. During the adventure, Link learns that the Twilight are descendants of an ancient group of people known as the Interlopers. This ancient group was punished for their use of dark magic, being banished to live in the realm perpetually shrouded in twilight. And after the ages have passed, they are still paying for the mistakes of their ancestors, harboring resentment towards aliens. Ultimately, it is revealed that Zant had always been but a pawn in the game of an ancient villain, Ganondorf, the evil sorcerer wielder of the Triforce of Power, which he once used to conquer Hyrule, but was eventually defeated by the previous incarnation of Link and banished to the Twilight Realm. This opening to the game already features some Gothic themes or literary devices, like the corruption of a peaceful and idyllic setting, Link's and Midna's physical and spiritual transformations, the uncanniness of the Twilight Realm's eternal dusk, or the labyrinthian dungeon in which Link and Midna are kept. After having briefly explained Twilight Princess's plot, I would like to talk about some of the locations in the game and how they relate to Gothic architecture or themes. For starters, many Gothic stories have been situated within castles, so I find it very fitting to begin with the game's own. Flying buttresses and towers with pointy rooftops characterize Hyrule Castle. Not only is it a typical setting for a Gothic story, but within the castle, Ganondorf's powerful and malevolent will shapes the entire structure. Much like the man responsible for the hauntings in the 1859 Victorian story, The Hunters and the Hunted. The similarities between both characters are striking, as both of them are shown to be ageless tyrants manipulating reality from the shadows, mesmerizing their targets and projecting their will in disembodied forms. Another location that perfectly matches typical Gothic settings are the Snow Peak Ruins, a house in a remote location, miles away from civilization in Snow Peak Mountain, merging two popular Gothic settings, decayed mansions and imposing mountains. This manor sports a ribbed vault, and has seemingly been abandoned for a long time, with broken floorboards and ceilings. Entire wings of the mansion were damaged by the elements and covered in ice. The structure is inhabited by both a monstrous knight in a dungeon wielding a large weapon and a friendly Jedi couple, Yero and Niera. The couple sends the hero on brief quests across the area to gather ingredients for a soup to help Yero's sickly wife. Now, aesthetically, Snow Peak might remind audiences of Crimson Peak's Alardale Hall, while at the same time, some of the plot elements resemble the fall of the House of Usher. In both Twilight Princess and the Fall of the House of Usher, the protagonist, an external element to the family, living in the decayed mansion, is welcome to stay and tries to help a sick person. However, in Twilight Princess's case, the true challenge occurs when Niera is changed by a cursed item, the Twilight Mirror, which turns her into a twisted and aggressive version of herself. Moving into another location, architecture-wise, beautiful Gothic windows and pointed arches are fused with classical columns and marbled floors in the church-like Temple of Time, which itself is located deep in a remote forest, a typical Gothic setting. Some Gothic elements, however, are present in the role of the temple's main boss, Goma. This massive spider, commonly believed to have once been a regular spider that grew to this impressive size, might remind audiences of other large arachnids in Gothic stories like the Ash Tree and El Almohadón de Plumas. Goma is located at the lowest floor of the Temple of Time, but its offspring can be found in other rooms in the area, foreshadowing the boss's appearance, similar to the foreshadowing used in M.R. James's story, The Ash Tree. But Twilight Princess is characterized not just by its locations, but also by their monsters. This game is full of supernatural elements, particularly ghosts or ghost-like apparitions. The Poe, a terrifying blue-skinned ghost dressed with a white hoodie and sporting the face of a rotting corpse, might be particularly memorable to audiences. So are the Imp Poes, floating souls carrying a scythe like the Grim Reaper. Another such encounter I'd like to mention is Death's Sword, a sealed blade that, when freed from the seals, reveals a cursed animal-like skeleton of glowing eyes, capable of turning invisible and levitating. But Hyrule's ghosts are not all creatures of evil. For instance, the ghost of Queen Rutella, a benevolent ghost of a Sora mother executed by Xanth's forces, is always watching over her child, similar to Edith's mother in Crimson Peak. The ghosts of deceased soldiers in Hyrule Castle's graveyard are also noteworthy, guiding the hero to solve a puzzle. Another example of a guiding spirit can be found in the hero's shade, a previous incarnation of the hero's soul, who tragically died before being able to impart his teachings upon other knights. Despite having been the one who defeated Ganondorf ages ago, he is still tethered to this world until he can pass all of his skills to the current hero. Moreover, beyond the simple ghost, the hero's shade also shares similarities with doppelgangers in relation to the protagonist, having the same moves, soul, wolf transformation, name, and even appearance in life, while functioning as a twisted mirror of Link in their quests to defeat Ganondorf. Another theme of Gothic literature is forced monster transformations. A skin-crawling example of someone being turned into a dangerous monster against their will in this game is Princess Zelda herself, or rather her reanimated body, puppeteered by Ganondorf's dark magic after she had sacrificed her life force to save Link's companion, Midna. Alternatively, the previously mentioned Yera, who never desired to hurt anyone, was still turned into a monster by gazing into a fragment of the Twilight mirror. And the last example of this trope could very well be the heroes themselves. Link is turned into a wolf whenever he is exposed to the Twilight realm, whereas Midna was forcefully turned into an imp, incapable of challenging Zend on her own. Damsels in distress are a staple of Gothic literature. Two instances of this narrative device involve the kidnapping of Ilia, Link's childhood friend, and Midna's plight, the dramatic moment when Midna, Link's companion, is wounded by Zend and requires immediate help in a race against time. For the final point, I wanted to talk about Twilight Princess's manga, which provides an alternative version of Link's relationship with Midna. In it, the relationship is framed as romantic near the end, having formed a deep emotional connection from their shared trauma and the adversities they had to share. However, this relationship meets a tragic fate when Midna regains her real form. She comes to understand her role as the ruler over the Twilight Realm, and how their kingdoms must remain separate to prevent further tragedy, carrying the burden of her ancestors' sins. Midna pulls Link in for a kiss and returns to her dimension before shattering the mirror, permanently severing their connection. Tragic romances and transcendental love are heavily featured in Gothic romances, and this perfectly matches Link's and Midna's relationship.
While Twilight Princess uses these Gothic elements to create a dark fantasy world of ghosts and cursed kingdoms, Bloodborne takes those exact same ideas and pushes them into a much scarier, modern direction. Instead of a magical curse on a fantasy land, the horror here comes from mad science, corrupt churches, and a terrifying blood plague. Let's move away from the ancient forest and snowy ruins of Hyrule and step into the dark, rainy streets of Jornam.
I no longer dream, but I was once a hunter too. There's nothing more horrific than a hunt. In case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people. One day you will see.
Bloodborne takes place in Jornam, a city inspired by the Gothic aesthetic, with a dark gloom that surrounds it, and not much more than the moonlight and a few streetlights that continue to work. The protagonist is an outsider who travels to Jornam in search of an antidote for a sickness he had contracted, without knowing the living nightmare that was taking place in that same city. The protagonist, which we know as the Hunter, ends up discovering that the city of Jornam was being ravaged for something we know as the Plague of the Beasts, caused by the old blood, the blood of the Great Ones, ancient, godlike beings, much like the ones Lovecraft loved to write about. The plague makes humans turn into wild beasts, leaving nothing more than an uncontrollable desire for blood. The Hunter contracted the plague, so he joins an organization called the Hunters, who are the ones in charge of killing the beasts and cleaning the streets of Jornam of that disease. This is done in an attempt to find out what happened in that city, and most importantly, to find a cure for the plague. Bloodborne inspires heavily in Gothic literary works, as we can find not only monsters, but also characters that have a very recurrent role in Gothic literature. For example, the archetype of the mad scientists, which we can find in Ludwig, head of the Church of Healing. This church explored the dangers of using the Great One's blood in humans, and they were one of the main causes for the plague of the beasts. Ludwig was one of the first humans to ever learn about the effect of using the old blood in humans. However, he ignored all the consequences just to keep his experiments going. He was looking for a way to leave his humanity behind and ascend into another plane of existence. The archetype of mad scientist can be found in works like The Birthmark and Rappaccini's Daughter, characterized by the need to experiment with forces the human being doesn't understand, no matter the consequences. Bloodborne monsters are also heavily inspired by those from the Victorian Gothic stories, such as the beasts themselves. The beasts are inspired by werewolves, like the ones from stories like Clement Hausmann's The Werewolf, or George W.M. Reynolds' novel, Wagner, The Werewolf, also taking great inspiration in these types of stories to create characters like Vicar Amelia, a high-ranking member of the Church of Healing. Other popular Gothic monsters presented in Bloodborne are a variant of zombie vampires known as brainsuckers. Another very recurrent subject in Gothic works is the life after death, as we can see in works like Frankenstein or The Fall of the House Usher. Bloodborne uses this resource as a way to justify the hunter's death. The hunter dies just at the start of the game and is transported to a place known as the Hunter's Dream, which is explained to be the place where hunters go after dying so they can prepare themselves to continue the hunt once more. Onward in the game, the hunter is unable to die due to this bond with the hunter's dream, coming back to life again and again after each death. Besides the literary inspiration, there are three main locations where the game takes place in which we can see Victorian architecture involving flying buttresses, found in the exterior design of castles and manors, ribbed vaults present in the interior design, and pointed arches on rooftops and windows. Bloodborne begins in Josefka's claustrophobic clinic. In Victorian Gothic design, the domestic sphere was often treated with a sense of melancholy sanctity. In the concept art for the clinic, these domestic Victorian elements are corrupted by cold, clinical utility. These tensions mirrors a classic Victorian Gothic trope, the domestic horror, a subgenre we can find in works like The Hunters and the Hunted, where the safeness of home is subverted. Moving into central Jarnam, the architecture transitions into a chaotic manifestation of the 19th century Gothic architecture. The concept art drawings, like the final design included in the game, depict an urban nightmare defined by extreme verticality, an architectural arms race where buildings stacked precariously upon one another. This layout heavily references the Victorian fascinations with medieval thrift, featuring crowded cobblestone streets, soaring spires, and flying buttresses that seem structurally impossible. Far removed from the industrial and religious sprawl of Jornam, the artwork for Castle Kenehurst and its upper spires shifts the narrative toward a much older, aristocratic iteration of the Gothic style. The concept designs for the base of the castle and its upper reaches depict a frozen monument to isolation, drawn directly from the literary traditions of the Victorian era, reminiscent of the buildings found in classic vampire lore, or, to be specific, Bram Stoker's Dracula. the architectural insanity of Bloodborne reaches its peak in the terrifying nightmare of Menzies. Here, the principles of Victorian Gothic architecture are heightened to their peak. The concept art depicts a fractured castle that defies structural logic, where massive Gothic towers, arches, and stone bridges float and split apart above a rocky, desolated void. As the name indicates, this realm is a nightmare where even the architecture is there to torment the hunter. But the Victorian Gothic influence is not only present on the edifications, also in the clothes of the characters the hunter meets along the way. Characters like the doll, a literal porcelain doll, stands as a direct personification of the Victorian domestic ideal. She represents the angel in the house, being wrapped into something deeply uncanny. Her design relies heavily on early to mid-Victorian women's attire, characterized by a heavy tirette bonnet and a French woolen shawl decorated with traditional motifs. More examples of Victorian fashion sense included in Bloodborne are the Hunter's attire, Ailing the Crow attire, and Father Gascoigne's attire. As you might remember, we are introduced to a race called the Great Ones, beings that defy the very human sense of logic in all the ways possible, seen as by gods by the characters in the game. Through dialogue with other characters, we are told the story of what really happened in Jarnam. People found out that the blood of a Great One could cure any disease, enhance physical abilities, and prolong life expectation of any person that uses it, without knowing that the same blood they used to try to ascend would be the blood that would eventually cause the plague that ends it all, the plague of the beasts. The hunter actually gets to see and confront some of the Great Ones, or at least their known physical form, and in the process, the hunter sees the monstrosities, with an aspect so horrid the human brain couldn't even begin to imagine if it weren't shown its appearance. Some of the physical forms of the Great Ones include Everietas, daughter of the cosmos, whom is inspired by Cthulhu from the Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. Rom, the vacuous spider, which we can associate with whatever the monster looks like in Almohadón de Plumas by Horacio Quiroga, and Amygdala, whom the player has to confront in the order to continue their journey. The design of this creature is made to defy any type of anatomy known by the human being, something so physically impossible it couldn't be described with any words, just the same way Lovecraft's descriptions of monsters are vague and incomprehensible. Ultimately, both The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and Bloodborne demonstrate that the enduring power of the Gothic literature lies in its ability to externalize internal human anxieties through setting, anatomy, and costume, while separated by different core mythologies, one rooted in fantasy feudal tragedy and other in clinical cosmic nihilism. Both games rely on the exact same Victorian blueprints to evoke a sense of Gothic sublime. From the claustrophobic entrapments of Josefka's clinic to the decaying isolation of snow-peaked ruins, these spaces weaponize flying buttresses, pointed arches, and ribbed walls not just as decorative backdrops, but as physical representations of ancestral curses and psychological deterioration. By merging the structural honesty of Gothic architecture with the psychological terror of ghosts, mad scientists, doppelgangers, and incomprehensible cosmic entities, Both games achieve the ultimate goal of the Gothic tradition. They trap the player in an immersive atmosphere where history is a burden, reality is a labyrinth, and the environment itself is a hostile entity. In the end, both narrative proves that the greatest terrors are not monsters waiting in the dark, but the terrifying realization of what lurks within our own inherited bloodlines, hidden institutions, and subconscious minds. That will be all for today. Thank you for watching, be safe, and fear the old blood.